A civilization at its peak, unaware of the coming collapse. History rarely announces its turning points. Civilizations do not wake up one morning knowing they stand at the edge of ruin. Instead, collapse often hides behind prosperity, ambition, and confidence. The world before the storm is always a world that believes it has mastered its own future. At the height of this great civilization, everything appeared balanced. Power was distributed through carefully constructed political systems, alliances were sealed with treaties and ceremonies, and rulers spoke the language of stability. Cities expanded outward with geometric precision, their streets filled with merchants, scholars, and craftsmen who believed they were living in the safest era humanity had ever known. The idea of collapse felt almost offensive, an insult to progress itself. Economic prosperity was the foundation of this confidence. Trade routes stretched across continents, carrying silk, grain, gold, and ideas from one corner of the world to another. Markets thrived, currencies stabilized, and wealth accumulated not only in royal treasuries, but also in the homes of ordinary citizens. For many, survival was no longer the primary concern. Comfort, status, and ambition replaced fear as the driving forces of daily life. This abundance reshaped how people saw themselves. A new sense of identity emerged, one rooted in success rather than struggle. Citizens believed their civilization was not merely powerful, but permanent. Parents raised children with the assumption that tomorrow would always be better than yesterday. Architects built monuments meant to last forever, while philosophers wrote theories explaining why this order of the world was not only natural, but inevitable. Politically, the era was defined by balance rather than chaos. No single power appeared capable of dominating the entire world, and that illusion of equilibrium created a dangerous sense of security. Rival states respected boundaries drawn by diplomacy and war alike, believing those lines would hold. Leaders gathered in grand halls, shaking hands beneath banners of unity, convinced that rational negotiation had finally tamed humanity's violent instincts. Yet beneath this surface harmony, subtle fractures had already begun to form. The political balance depended heavily on personalities rather than principles. Charismatic rulers held fragile coalitions together through personal influence, not institutional strength. Advisors whispered reassurances instead of warnings, fearing that honesty might cost them favor or position. Decisions were increasingly shaped by pride and legacy, as leaders focused more on how history would remember them than on what the future required. Economic success, once a blessing, slowly became a source of vulnerability. Wealth concentrated in powerful centers, while distant regions quietly struggled to keep pace. The gap between abundance and scarcity widened, though it was rarely discussed in public. The system functioned well enough to mask inequality, allowing those at the top to believe prosperity was universal. Discontent, when it appeared, was dismissed as temporary unrest rather than a symptom of deeper imbalance. Culturally, the civilization celebrated itself relentlessly. Art, literature, and public rituals glorified conquest, innovation, and superiority. Stories of past hardships were reframed as heroic obstacles already overcome, reinforcing the belief that the worst was behind them. The collective memory softened pain into legend, stripping history of its warnings. Religion and ideology played their part as well. Many believed divine favor protected their world, interpreting success as proof of moral righteousness. Victories in trade or diplomacy were seen not as fragile achievements, but as signs of destiny fulfilled. This belief system discouraged self-examination. Questioning the direction of society began to feel like betrayal rather than responsibility. Meanwhile, the military, once a shield against chaos, had grown complacent. Generations had passed without a true existential threat, and preparation slowly gave way to ceremony.
Parades replaced drills, and symbols replaced strategy. Officers believed experience from old wars would apply forever, underestimating how quickly the nature of conflict could change. Ordinary people sensed none of this with urgency. Daily life felt predictable. Laws were enforced, food was available, and entertainment flourished. Public spaces echoed with laughter, debate, and optimism. Even those who struggled trusted the system to eventually reward patience and loyalty. Faith in institutions remained strong, and that faith itself became a form of blindness. Some voices, however, did attempt to warn of what lay ahead. A few scholars pointed to historical patterns, noting how previous civilizations had also believed themselves immune to decline. Economists quietly questioned whether growth could continue at its current pace. Border officials reported rising tensions and unfamiliar movements beyond the edges of known territory. Yet these warnings were fragmented and inconvenient. They disrupted the narrative of progress, and so they were largely ignored. The ruling class had much to lose from doubt. Stability justified their authority, and prosperity validated their decisions. To acknowledge vulnerability would require sacrifice, reform, and humility, qualities rarely rewarded in times of success. It was far easier to dismiss warning signs as exaggeration, fear, or even sabotage. As the civilization expanded, it stretched its systems thinner. Managing distant territories required faster decisions and harsher enforcement. Local cultures were absorbed or suppressed in the name of unity, creating quiet resentment. Loyalty was assumed, not earned. The empire grew outward faster than trust could follow. Ironically, the very achievements that defined this golden age also ensured its fragility. Interconnected trade meant that disruption in one region could ripple across the entire world. Political alliances tied fates together so tightly that the failure of one threatened all. Efficiency left little room for error, and optimization eliminated redundancy, the very thing needed in times of crisis. The people celebrated innovation, yet resisted change. New technologies were embraced for comfort and profit, but institutional reform lagged behind. Systems designed for a simpler era struggled under modern complexity. Still, life went on, and success continued to reinforce denial. From a distance, the civilization appeared unstoppable. From within, it felt normal, safe, familiar, and eternal. That was the greatest illusion of all. Because collapse does not begin with fire and invasion. It begins with certainty, with the belief that tomorrow is guaranteed, that systems will correct themselves, that power is permanent. The storm does not arrive suddenly. It gathers patiently at the horizon, unnoticed by those too busy admiring the calm.
Lines drawn by power. How borders were created by ambition, not by people. Borders are often presented as facts of nature, clean lines on maps, defended by laws and flags, accepted as if they have always existed. Yet most borders were not born from the lives of the people who lived along them. They were drawn by power, shaped by ambition, and enforced by those who stood far from the land they divided. In the age of expanding empires, maps became weapons. Rulers no longer needed to conquer every village with armies alone. They could claim entire regions with ink and parchment. In distant capitals, leaders leaned over tables, pointing to rivers they had never crossed and mountains they had never climbed, deciding where one world would end and another would begin. The land itself had no voice in these rooms, and neither did the people who depended on it for survival. For the powerful, borders were tools of control. They simplified governance, defined taxation, and legitimized authority. A line on a map could transform farmers into foreigners overnight. Families who had traded, married, and worshipped together for generations suddenly found themselves separated by an invisible barrier backed by law and force. What had once been a shared homeland became contested territory.
Ambition fueled this process. Empires sought resources, strategic depth, and prestige. Borders expanded and contracted with wars, treaties, and dynastic marriages. Victory allowed the strong to redraw reality itself, while defeat erased centuries of local identity. The act of drawing borders was often celebrated as progress, a symbol of order imposed upon chaos. But that order served the center of power, not the edges. The people living in these borderlands experienced the consequences first. Their loyalty was questioned, their culture scrutinized, their movements restricted. They were expected to adopt new languages, laws, and rulers without consent. Resistance, when it emerged, was labeled rebellion rather than self-preservation. History recorded the decisions of emperors and generals, but rarely the grief of villagers whose world had been split in two. Colonial expansion carried this practice to its extreme. As empires reached across oceans, borders were drawn with even less regard for human reality. Entire continents were divided according to European rivalries, not local geography or social structures. Straight lines cut through deserts, forests, and ethnic territories, ignoring centuries of coexistence and conflict resolution. What mattered was balance between empires, not balance within societies. These artificial borders created fragile states long before the term existed. Groups with deep historical rivalries were forced into shared political systems, while unified cultures were fractured into multiple jurisdictions. Administrations struggled to govern populations that had never chosen to be governed together. Stability depended on coercion rather than consensus, and peace required constant suppression of unresolved tensions. The long-term consequences were profound. Borders defined access to land, water, and trade routes, shaping economic opportunity for generations. Communities on the wrong side of a line found themselves marginalized, taxed differently, or excluded from political power. Migration, once seasonal and voluntary, became criminalized. Identity hardened around nationality, replacing older, more fluid affiliations. Powerful states defended these borders fiercely, even as their origins faded from memory. Over time, the lines drawn by ambition were taught as sacred truths. School books framed them as historical inevitabilities, and flags transformed them into symbols of unity. Questioning borders became synonymous with threatening order itself. Yet borders remained unstable precisely because they were never organic. They required constant reinforcement, military bases, checkpoints, surveillance, and bureaucracy. Where borders aligned poorly with human geography, conflict persisted. Smuggling, insurgency, and unrest flourished in the gaps between imposed order and lived reality. For ordinary people, the cost was measured in small, relentless ways. A trader forced to pay new taxes, a family divided by citizenship, a language slowly erased from public life. These were not dramatic events worthy of monuments, but they accumulated over time, shaping lives just as surely as wars shaped empires. Even when empires fell, their borders often survived. New nations inherited old lines, fearing that redrawing them would unleash chaos. The past thus extended its influence into the future, trapping generations within frameworks they never chose. Independence brought flags and anthems, but rarely freedom from the map itself. In some regions, borders became flashpoints of violence. Disputes over territory ignited wars decades or even centuries after the original lines were drawn. Leaders invoked history selectively, using borders as justification for expansion or defense, even when those borders had no deep historical roots. Power continued to shape geography, just as it always had. The irony is that borders were meant to create order, yet they often produced instability. By ignoring human complexity, they simplified the world in ways that made governance easier, but coexistence harder. They turned neighbors into rivals, and diversity into a threat. What was drawn to prevent conflict frequently ensured its persistence. In the modern era, globalization challenged the meeting of borders without eliminating their impact. Goods, capital, and information crossed lines more freely than people. Those with privilege navigated borders as inconveniences, while the vulnerable experienced them as walls. The unequal legacy of power remained embedded in visas, passports, and economic opportunity. Looking back, it becomes clear that borders tell a story, not of unity, but of dominance. They reveal whose voices mattered and whose were ignored. They expose the belief that land could be owned, divided, and controlled without consent. And they remind us that political order, when built without humanity, carries the seeds of future conflict. The lines drawn by power still shape the modern world. They influence elections, wars, migration crises, and cultural identity. They determine who belongs and who does not. And though they appear fixed on maps, they remain products of choice, choices made by ambition rather than people.
The silent architects of history. Kings, strategists, and shadows behind the throne. History remembers crowns, not whispers. It celebrates kings and generals, not the minds that guided their hands. Yet behind every empire that rose and every war that reshaped the world stood figures whose names were never carved into stone. These were the silent architects of history, strategists, advisors, financiers, and shadows who shaped destiny without ever standing in the light. In royal courts and imperial chambers, power rarely belonged to the one who wore the crown alone. Kings ruled, but they did not rule alone. They depended on councils, advisors, and unseen networks of influence that translated ambition into policy. These individuals understood something rulers often did not, that true power did not require public recognition. It required access, timing, and the ability to shape decisions before they became visible. Strategists were among the most influential of these unseen figures. They studied not just armies and borders, but human behavior. They knew when to provoke fear, when to promise peace, and when silence was more effective than command. While generals prepared for war, strategists decided whether war would happen at all. They framed threats, exaggerated dangers, and identified opportunities long before swords were drawn. Many of these architects never appeared in official records. Their success depended on remaining invisible. A victory credited to a king was proof of a strategist's mastery. A failure, if it occurred, could be quietly erased. Influence flowed through private conversations, carefully worded letters, and alliances formed in corridors rather than chambers. The public saw decisive rulers. The reality was far more complex. Behind the throne also stood financiers and merchants whose wealth quietly shaped policy. Wars were expensive, and no campaign could begin without resources. Those who controlled money controlled possibility. Loans determined which battles could be fought, which territories could be defended, and which ambitions had to be abandoned. Interest rates influenced diplomacy as much as ideology did. Yet the names of these financiers rarely appeared in historical narratives, their power hidden behind the illusion of royal authority. Religious leaders and philosophers also played their part. They framed events in moral language, providing justification for conquest, obedience, and sacrifice. A war could be recast as a divine mission, a rebellion as heresy. By shaping belief, they shaped behavior. People did not need to understand strategy if they believed history itself was on their side. Information, perhaps the most subtle form of power, was controlled by scribes, messengers, and record-keepers. What was written down became history. What was omitted vanished. Chronicles were curated, not recorded. Failures were softened, enemies demonized, and allies glorified. Truth was filtered through loyalty. Those who controlled narrative controlled memory, and memory controlled legitimacy. In many empires, entire intelligence networks operated in silence. Spies gathered information from rival courts, borderlands, and even within their own capitals. Knowledge of an enemy's weakness could prevent a war or provoke one at the perfect moment. These agents lived in constant anonymity, their successes never celebrated, their failures often fatal. They existed to ensure that rulers appeared omniscient, even when they were not. Women, too, often occupied these shadowed spaces of power. Excluded from formal authority, many exercised influence through marriage alliances, correspondence, and courtly relationships. Queens, concubines, and noblewomen acted as diplomats, negotiators, and intermediaries. Their influence shaped succession, alliances, and policy, yet history frequently reduced them to footnotes or stereotypes. The silent architects understood the fragility of power. They knew that empires were not destroyed by enemies alone, but by internal fractures, ego, complacency, and misinformation. Their task was to manage these risks, to maintain the illusion of control, even when control was slipping away. Sometimes they succeeded brilliantly, sometimes they delayed the inevitable. But invisibility came at a cost. These figures bore responsibility without recognition. When decisions led to disaster, blame fell on visible leaders. When peace endured, credit went to kings and treaties. The silent architects remained hidden, their influence denied by the very system they upheld. As empires expanded, the network of shadows grew denser. Governance became too complex for any single ruler to manage. Authority fragmented into specialized roles: military planners, economic advisors, colonial administrators, each shaping a piece of the whole. Power became distributed, yet accountability remained centralized. This imbalance allowed manipulation to thrive. The greatest danger posed by these unseen architects was not malice, but detachment. Operating behind closed doors, they often lost sight of the human cost of their decisions. Borders were adjusted, populations relocated, resources extracted, all in the name of stability or progress. Suffering became abstract, reduced to numbers and projections. The further power moved from the people, the quieter their voices became. In moments of crisis, the influence of these figures became most visible, though still unnamed. Succession disputes, economic collapse, or military defeat forced rapid decisions. Advisors who had guided prosperity now scrambled to preserve order. Some adapted, others clung to outdated assumptions. A single miscalculation could accelerate decline. History tends to simplify these moments, attributing collapse to weak rulers or external enemies. Rarely does it examine the network of influence that shaped those outcomes. Yet decline, like rise, is collective. It emerges from decisions made over time, often by people who believed they were protecting the system. In the aftermath of empire, many silent architects disappeared into obscurity. Some adapted to new regimes, transferring their skills to new masters. Others were scapegoated, punished for failures they did not solely cause. Most were forgotten, their contributions absorbed into the myth of singular leadership. Even in the modern world, the pattern persists. Power still operates behind the scenes, in advisory boards, intelligence agencies, financial institutions, and media networks. Leaders still rely on unseen architects to navigate complexity, and history still struggles to capture their role, preferring faces to systems, names to networks. Understanding these hidden figures does not diminish the responsibility of rulers, it deepens it. It reveals that power is rarely isolated and that accountability must extend beyond the throne. It challenges the comforting narrative that history is shaped by a few great individuals rather than by interconnected structures of influence. The silent architects of history remind us that what we see is never the full story. that behind every public decision lies a web of private counsel, and that the forces shaping our world are often quiet, patient, and unseen, working in shadows long before their impact becomes visible.
Whispers of rebellion. When ordinary voices began to challenge extraordinary power. Every great shift in history begins quietly, not with armies marching or banners raised, but with whispers, questions spoken in markets, doubts shared in taverns, ideas exchanged in letters never meant to be preserved. Long before rebellion became visible, it existed as a murmur beneath the surface of everyday life. This was the moment when ordinary voices first dared to challenge extraordinary power. For generations, authority had been accepted as inevitable. Kings ruled by tradition, empires expanded by force, and obedience was framed as virtue. Most people lived their lives within boundaries they did not choose, believing resistance was either impossible or immoral. Power felt distant, immense, and unchangeable, like the sky itself. Yet, cracks had begun to appear. Economic strain, uneven prosperity, and rigid social hierarchies slowly eroded trust in the system. While elites spoke of stability and progress, common people experienced rising taxes, restricted movement, and shrinking opportunity. The contrast between official narratives and lived reality grew impossible to ignore. People did not immediately rebel, but they began to notice. The first whispers were not demands for revolution, they were questions. Why were some families forever privileged while others remained trapped? Why were laws applied unevenly? Why did distant rulers decide local fates? These questions spread not through speeches, but through conversation, shared between neighbors, co-workers, and travelers who carried stories from one region to another. Markets became centers of exchange not just for goods, but for ideas. News traveled with merchants, sailors, and pilgrims, connecting grievances that had once felt isolated. A farmer's complaint in one province echoed a craftsman's frustration in another. Slowly, people realized their struggles were not individual failures, but shared conditions. Rebellious thinkers emerged from unexpected places. Some were scholars, educated enough to articulate injustice in philosophical language. Others were laborers who spoke with the authority of experience rather than theory. They challenged sacred assumptions, that power was divinely ordained, that hierarchy was natural, that obedience guaranteed protection. Their ideas were radical not because they called for violence, but because they questioned inevitability. Pamphlets, songs, and sermons became tools of dissent. Written in accessible language, they bypassed elite institutions and spoke directly to the people. Ideas that once belonged to private conversations entered public spaces. Concepts like fairness, consent, and representation began to circulate, unsettling systems built on silence and compliance. Authorities responded predictably, with dismissal at first. Rulers underestimated the power of words, believing unrest without weapons posed little threat. Dissenters were labeled troublemakers, dreamers, or traitors. A few arrests were meant to restore order, but they often did the opposite. Suppression gave ideas credibility. Punished voices gained audiences they never would have reached in freedom. As whispers grew louder, informal leaders began to emerge. These were not always nobles or generals. They were community figures, teachers, veterans, clergy, merchants, people trusted not for their rank, but for their integrity. They translated abstract ideas into shared purpose, connecting dissatisfaction with hope.
For many, rebellion was not about overthrowing the system, but reforming it. Early movements demanded recognition, fairness, and accountability rather than destruction. They believed power could be reasoned with, that rulers could be persuaded to listen. This belief revealed both their optimism and their vulnerability. The response from authority hardened as the movement spread. Surveillance increased, meetings were banned, censorship intensified. What had been tolerated as minor dissent was now framed as existential threat. The line between criticism and rebellion blurred, forcing people to choose sides whether they wished to or not. Fear played a crucial role. For the powerful, fear of losing control justified repression. For the people, fear of punishment tested commitment. Many fell silent again, retreating into private life. Others became more determined, convinced that the system could not be trusted to reform itself. In moments of confrontation, courage revealed itself in small acts, refusing unfair taxes, hiding banned texts, protecting organizers. These acts rarely appeared heroic at the time, but they sustained the movement when open resistance was impossible. Rebellion was no longer just an idea, it was a lived experience. Charismatic leaders eventually rose from the movement, capable of unifying fragmented voices. They spoke with clarity and conviction, framing resistance as moral duty rather than reckless defiance. Their presence gave the movement direction, but also made it vulnerable. Leadership centralized hope and risk. Not all rebellions succeeded. Some were crushed quickly, leaving behind martyrs rather than victories. Others fractured under internal disagreement, divided by strategy, ideology, or identity. Power exploited these divisions, offering concessions to some while punishing others. The dream of unity proved difficult to sustain under pressure. Yet even failed rebellions changed history. They altered how power was perceived. Once questioned, authority could never fully return to unquestioned legitimacy. The idea that ordinary people had the right to challenge rulers had entered the collective consciousness, and it could not be erased. In time, rebellion reshaped political language itself. Concepts once considered dangerous became mainstream. Rulers adopted the rhetoric of reform to maintain control, promising representation, rights, and participation. Whether these promises were sincere or strategic mattered less than the fact that power now felt compelled to justify itself. The whispers that began in private spaces eventually reached the halls of power. Some were answered with reform, others with violence, but all forced change. The relationship between ruler and ruled permanently shifted, even where empires survived. History often remembers rebellions for their climactic moments, battles, declarations, revolutions. But those moments were built on years of quiet resistance, on conversations never recorded, on courage exercised without applause. The true significance of these whispers lies not in their volume, but in their persistence. They reveal that power, no matter how vast, depends on acceptance. And when acceptance begins to erode, even the mightiest structures tremble.
Fire across the continent. War, blood, and the breaking point of empires. War did not arrive as a single moment of explosion. It spread like fire, slow at first, then all at once. What began as isolated clashes and political standoffs soon ignited an entire continent. The age of certainty collapsed under the weight of violence, and empires discovered how fragile their power truly was.
The first battles were framed as necessary actions, limited engagements meant to restore order. Leaders spoke of discipline and control, insisting that force would be brief and decisive. Flags were raised, armies mobilized, and citizens were told that sacrifice would be minimal. Few understood that these early decisions had already crossed a point of no return. Strategy replaced diplomacy. Military planners mapped terrain, supply routes, and population centers with clinical precision. Rivers became defensive lines, cities turned into targets, and farmland was reduced to strategic ground. Human life was measured in terms of advantage and loss. War transformed geography into a chessboard where each move carried irreversible consequences. Betrayal played its role early and often. Alliances forged in times of peace fractured under pressure. Former partners turned enemies overnight, driven by fear, ambition, or the promise of survival. Secret agreements were signed, intelligence sold, and loyalties shifted in the shadows. Trust, once the glue of political order, evaporated in the heat of conflict. As fighting spread, the illusion of control vanished. Armies clashed not only on battlefields, but in villages, forests, and streets. Civilians became targets by proximity rather than intent. Homes were seized for shelter, crops destroyed to deny supplies, and entire communities displaced in the name of strategy. War erased the boundary between soldier and citizen. The human cost was staggering. Bodies piled in numbers too large to mourn individually. Disease spread through camps and cities alike, fed by hunger and exhaustion. Survivors carried wounds, both visible and unseen, trauma that would outlast the conflict itself. The language of honor and glory could not conceal the reality of suffering. Empires strained under the weight of prolonged warfare. Maintaining armies required enormous resources, draining treasuries and destabilizing economies. Taxes increased, trade collapsed, and inflation eroded livelihoods. The same people who had once believed in stability now faced scarcity and uncertainty. Support for the war weakened, even as leaders insisted victory was near. Internal divisions deepened. Different regions experienced the war unevenly, fueling resentment and mistrust. Some profited from contracts and supplies, while others lost everything. Accusations of disloyalty became common, and repression intensified. In the name of security, freedoms were suspended, and dissent was silenced. The battlefield itself evolved. New tactics and technologies increased lethality, making older strategies obsolete. Commanders struggled to adapt, often repeating mistakes at devastating cost. Each innovation promised advantage, yet amplified destruction. Progress, once celebrated, now manifested as efficiency in killing. For soldiers, the war became a test of endurance rather than ideology. Initial enthusiasm faded into fatigue and disillusionment. Orders were followed out of necessity, not belief. Camaraderie offered brief comfort, but could not erase the fear of sudden death. Letters home grew shorter, heavy with unspoken despair. Betrayal was not limited to diplomacy. Commanders sacrificed units to protect reputations or delay defeat. Intelligence was withheld, reinforcements delayed, and truth manipulated. The distance between leadership and frontline reality widened dangerously. Those who planned the war rarely experienced its consequences. As casualties mounted, victory became increasingly abstract. Goals shifted, redefined to justify continued sacrifice. What had once been a war to restore order transformed into a struggle to avoid humiliation. Empires fought not to win, but to avoid losing, trapped by their own rhetoric and pride. Cities that had symbolized prosperity now lay in ruins. Libraries burned alongside homes, erasing knowledge and memory alike. Cultural landmarks were reduced to rubble, severing connections to the past. Reconstruction felt unimaginable amid ongoing destruction. The psychological impact reached beyond borders. Refugees flooded neighboring regions, spreading instability and fear. Neutral states were drawn in, willingly or not. The conflict reshaped the entire continent, collapsing the distinction between center and periphery. No place remained untouched. At the breaking point, cracks within empires widened into fractures. Military defeat exposed political weakness. Economic collapse undermined legitimacy. Once loyal populations questioned authority openly. The same voices that had once whispered rebellion now shouted demands for change. Some empires responded with brutality, doubling down on repression. Others attempted reform too late, offering concessions that no longer satisfied. The war had altered expectations permanently. People who had survived unimaginable loss refused to return to the old order. The end, when it came, did not resemble triumph. Armistices were signed in exhaustion rather than celebration. Borders shifted again, drawn through blood-soaked land. Leaders claimed victory, but the cost defied justification. Entire generations had been consumed by the fire. In the aftermath, the true impact of the war became clear. Empires still standing were hollowed out, their authority weakened, their future uncertain. Those that fell left power vacuums filled with instability rather than peace. The continent entered a new era defined not by confidence, but by caution and grief. War had done more than break armies, it had broken illusions. The belief in inevitable progress, rational control, and permanent power was shattered. History moved forward, but it did so on a foundation of loss.
The fall no one expected, how the mighty collapsed from within. Empires rarely fall the way they expect to. They prepare for invasion, fortify borders, and train armies to repel external threats. What they struggle to defend against is erosion from within, the slow decay of trust, purpose, and competence that weakens even the most powerful structures. When the end finally comes, it often arrives not as a sudden conquest, but as an internal surrender. At the height of its power, this empire appeared unshakable. Its enemies feared it, its allies depended on it, and its institutions projected confidence. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations were already cracking. The very systems that had once ensured stability had grown rigid, unable to adapt to new realities. Strength had hardened into fragility. The first signs of decline were subtle. Administrative inefficiency spread quietly through bureaucracies swollen by expansion. Decisions took longer, accountability blurred, and responsibility was passed upward or downward without resolution. What had once been effective governance turned into procedural paralysis. The empire still functioned, but only in appearance. Corruption followed naturally. Power concentrated in fewer hands, and with concentration came abuse. Officials prioritized personal gain over public service, extracting wealth from the system without reinvesting in it. Laws were enforced selectively, favoring loyalty over competence. For ordinary citizens, justice became unpredictable, undermining faith in institutions meant to protect them. Economic imbalance deepened the crisis. Prolonged war had drained resources, but leadership refused to adjust expectations. Instead of reforming structures, they increased pressure on the population. Higher taxes,
forced labor, and aggressive resource extraction. Productivity declined, trade networks weakened, and inflation eroded savings. The economy, once a source of pride, became a source of resentment. The military, long seen as the empire's backbone, suffered its own internal decay. Promotions were increasingly based on political connections rather than merit. Training standards declined, discipline weakened, and morale eroded. Soldiers were asked to defend a system that no longer seemed worth protecting. Loyalty could not be commanded indefinitely. It had to be earned. Leadership itself became the empire's greatest liability. Isolated by privilege and ceremony, rulers lost touch with reality. Advisors filtered information to preserve favor, creating an echo chamber of reassurance. Warnings were dismissed as pessimism, criticism labeled disloyalty. The leadership believed in the myth of their own invincibility long after it had ceased to be true. Internal divisions widened. Different regions experienced decline unevenly, fueling regionalism and resentment. Local leaders began prioritizing self-preservation over imperial unity. What was once cooperation turned into quiet competition. Loyalty shifted from the center to the local, weakening the empire's cohesion. Cultural decay compounded these structural failures. Civic identity eroded as shared values gave way to cynicism. Rituals and symbols remained, but their meaning felt hollow. Patriotism became performative rather than sincere. People followed rules out of habit, not belief. The emotional bond between citizen and state dissolved. Information control, once a tool of stability, accelerated collapse. By suppressing bad news, leadership blinded itself. Problems went unaddressed until they became crises. When reality finally intruded, it did so with overwhelming force. Trust in official narratives collapsed, replaced by rumors and fear. The empire's legal framework, once admired for consistency, became inflexible. Laws designed for an earlier era failed to address new challenges. Attempts at reform were blocked by those who benefited from the status quo. Innovation was stifled and adaptation delayed. The system protected itself even as it undermined its own survival. Social inequality reached a breaking point. Wealth disparity became impossible to justify in the face of widespread hardship. Elites insulated themselves from consequences, retreating into fortified spaces of comfort. For the majority, sacrifice no longer felt shared. Resentment turned into quiet defiance, then open disobedience. The collapse accelerated when external pressure returned, not as the primary cause, but as a catalyst. Enemies exploited internal weakness, but they did not create it. Border defenses failed, not because they were attacked, but because they were neglected. The empire's fall was decided long before the final blows were struck. At the center, decision-making froze. Conflicting priorities paralyzed action. Some leaders called for reform, others for repression. The lack of unified vision made any response ineffective. Each faction believed it was saving the empire. Together, they ensured its end. The moment of collapse did not feel dramatic. There was no single event to mark the end. Authority simply stopped functioning. Orders were ignored, taxes unpaid, and laws unenforced. Power drained away quietly, leaving behind confusion rather than conquest. For the people, the fall was both terrifying and liberating. The system that had dominated their lives vanished, but so did the protections it provided. Uncertainty replaced oppression. Some mourned the loss of stability, others welcomed the chance for change. All were forced to confront a future without the familiar structure of empire. In hindsight, the fall seemed inevitable. Historians would later trace it to countless decisions, compromises, and failures. No single betrayal destroyed the empire. It collapsed under the cumulative weight of its own contradictions. The greatest lesson of this collapse is not about enemies or battles. It is about neglect. Power that refuses to examine itself invites decay. Systems that prioritize control over legitimacy rot from within. Empires fall not when they are attacked, but when they forget why they exist.
Survivors of a shattered age, lives that continued after history moved on. When empires fall, history often rushes forward, eager to name new rulers and redraw maps. But for ordinary people, time does not move so quickly. The end of an age does not arrive as a clean conclusion. It lingers, heavy and unresolved. Long after banners are lowered and treaties signed, life continues in the shadows of what was lost. For survivors, the world after collapse felt unfamiliar, even when the streets remained the same. Buildings still stood, fields still waited to be planted, and seasons still turned. Yet everything carried a different weight. The certainty that once guided daily life was gone, replaced by caution and quiet fear. The future no longer felt guaranteed. Many returned from war carrying wounds that could not be seen. Soldiers who had marched with purpose came home without it. Sleep was restless, haunted by memories of violence and loss. Sounds once ordinary, a slammed door, a sudden shout, triggered fear. The war followed them into peacetime, shaping how they moved through the world. Civilians bore their own scars. Families had been divided by displacement, death, and forced migration. Some returned to find their homes destroyed or occupied by strangers. Others discovered that borders had shifted, turning familiar places into foreign territory. The land they belonged to no longer belonged to them. Grief became a shared language. Almost every household mourned someone, a parent, a child, a sibling, a neighbor. Funerals blurred together, and loss lost its ability to shock. People learned to carry absence as part of daily life. Survival demanded emotional restraint, even as sorrow remained close to the surface. Economic survival posed immediate challenges. Systems that once provided work and stability had collapsed with the empire. Currency lost value, trade networks fractured, and scarcity became common. People adapted out of necessity, bartering goods, sharing resources, and relying on informal networks of trust. Community replaced institution where the state had failed. Women often shouldered the burden of rebuilding. With men lost to war or unable to return to former roles, women became providers, caretakers, and decision-makers. They held families together, managed resources, and preserved cultural memory. Their labor sustained daily life, though recognition remained rare. Children grew up in the aftermath, shaped by stories of a world they never knew. They played among ruins, their games echoing with fragments of the past. Education, where it existed, focused less on ambition and more on survival. These children inherited not an empire, but its consequences. Mental resilience varied. Some clung to routine, finding comfort in repetition. Others struggled to adapt, overwhelmed by uncertainty. Faith, tradition, and storytelling became tools for coping, offering meaning when systems had failed. People sought stability not in power, but in connection. The collapse also reshaped identity. Without the empire's framework, people redefined who they were. Loyalty shifted from distant authority to local community. Old titles and statuses lost significance, replaced by practical contribution. Survival elevated skills over rank. Yet the past refused to disappear. Memories of the empire lingered in language, architecture, and law. Some remembered it with bitterness, others with nostalgia. For those who had benefited,
The loss felt like injustice. For those who had suffered, it felt like release. These conflicting memories shaped new tensions. Trauma was not evenly distributed. Some regions suffered more destruction, some communities faced greater loss. This imbalance fueled resentment and mistrust. Reconciliation proved difficult when pain was unequal. The absence of a unifying narrative left wounds open. Despite this, acts of quiet resilience emerged. Neighbors helped rebuild homes. Farmers replanted fields even when harvests were uncertain. Artists and storytellers captured loss and hope in their work, preserving experience for future generations. Life asserted itself in small, defiant ways. Political uncertainty added another layer of struggle. New authorities attempted to impose order, often without legitimacy or resources. Laws changed frequently, creating confusion and instability. People learned to navigate shifting power by staying flexible, avoiding visibility, and protecting their own. Some survivors chose to leave, migrating in search of safety or opportunity. Others stayed, bound by memory and attachment. Both choices carried risk. Movement promised escape but threatened loss of identity. Staying offered continuity but risked stagnation. Over time, the immediate shock softened into a new normal. The empire became a reference point rather than a reality. Stories replaced experience. The shattered age settled into memory, shaping values and caution. People learned to live with uncertainty rather than against it. What history often misses is this period of adjustment, the years when no great events occurred, but lives were rebuilt slowly and unevenly. These years determined the character of the future more than any battle or treaty. The survivors were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not conquer or command. They endured. They adapted. They carried forward what could be saved and let go of what could not. Their strength was quiet, unrecorded, and essential. As history moved on, they remained, bearing the weight of transition, shaping the world that would follow. The shattered age did not end with collapse. It lived on in the people who survived it, in their choices, fears, and hopes.
Truth buried under victory. What the winners chose not to remember. Victory has a voice. It speaks loudly, confidently, and often alone. When wars end and power settles into new hands, history is written not to explain what happened, but to justify what was gained. Triumph becomes the lens through which the past is viewed, and truth, complex, uncomfortable, and shared, quietly disappears beneath celebration. In the aftermath of conflict, the winners moved quickly to define the narrative. Parades replaced funerals, monuments replaced questions, flags were raised where ruins still smoldered. The story told was simple and reassuring. Sacrifice had been necessary, suffering had been meaningful, and the outcome had been inevitable. Complexity threatened unity, and so it was set aside. Official histories focused on decisive moments, battles won, treaties signed, leaders praised. They avoided the gray spaces where morality blurred and responsibility fractured. The cost of victory, measured in civilian lives and broken societies, was acknowledged only in abstract terms. Numbers replaced names. Loss became acceptable when framed as progress. Some truths were inconvenient. Atrocities committed by the victorious side were minimized or reframed as accidents of war. Strategic bombings were described as necessity, not choice. Forced relocations were called security measures. Language softened reality, transforming violence into policy and suffering into collateral.
Other truths threatened legitimacy. Internal dissent during the war, protests, resistance, moral opposition was erased or vilified. Those who questioned the conflict were remembered as unpatriotic rather than prescient. Unity was retroactively imposed, creating the illusion that the nation had always stood together. The experiences of marginalized groups were especially easy to bury. Minorities, colonized peoples, and displaced communities often suffered disproportionately, yet their stories rarely appeared in official accounts. Their pain did not align with the image of righteous victory. Silence became a second injustice. Institutions played a crucial role in shaping memory. Education systems standardized narratives, teaching simplified versions of events to future generations. Textbooks emphasized heroism and strategy, downplaying ethical ambiguity. What students learned was not false, but it was incomplete. Media reinforced these narratives. Films, novels, and public ceremonies celebrated bravery and sacrifice while avoiding reflection on consequences. Popular culture transformed war into legend, reducing complex histories to emotional symbols. Over time, these representations became more influential than reality itself. Even archives reflected selective memory. Documents were classified, destroyed, or curated. What remained accessible shaped scholarship for decades. Historians worked within the limits imposed by power, often unaware of what was missing. Absence became invisible. The winners also chose not to remember their own vulnerability. They framed victory as proof of superiority rather than circumstance. Luck, alliances, and enemy mistakes were ignored in favor of narratives of destiny and strength. This self-image discouraged humility and encouraged repetition of past mistakes. Yet buried truths did not disappear. They lived on in private memory, oral history, and fragmented records. Survivors carried stories that contradicted official accounts, stories of betrayal, cruelty, and moral compromise. These memories persisted quietly, passed down within families and communities. Over time, the gap between public narrative and private memory widened. Younger generations sensed the inconsistency, even if they could not articulate it. Questions emerged. Why were some voices missing? Why did certain events feel unresolved? Doubt seeped into certainty. Occasionally, buried truths resurfaced dramatically. Declassified documents revealed decisions made in secrecy. Whistleblowers exposed misconduct. Survivors spoke publicly after decades of silence. Each revelation challenged the mythology of victory, provoking resistance from those invested in the old story. The response was often defensive. Acknowledging wrongdoing threatened national identity and pride. Critics were accused of undermining unity or dishonoring sacrifice. The past became a battleground where memory itself was contested. Yet confronting buried truth did not erase sacrifice, it honored it honestly. Recognizing mistakes did not weaken legitimacy, it strengthened moral clarity. But such recognition required courage, the courage to accept that victory did not mean innocence. The refusal to remember fully had long-term consequences. Policies shaped by incomplete history repeated old patterns. Conflicts rooted in unresolved injustice resurfaced. Victims denied recognition remained alienated. Memory shaped behavior, and selective memory shaped failure. For the winners, forgetting was comfortable. For the world, it was costly. Peace built on denial proved fragile. Stability rooted in silence could not endure. History, when stripped of its shadows, becomes propaganda. It teaches loyalty without wisdom, pride without reflection. True understanding demands discomfort, the willingness to see victory not as an ending, but as a beginning burdened with responsibility. In time, societies faced a choice: preserve comforting myths or confront complex truths. Some chose remembrance, creating space for reconciliation and learning. Others clung to selective memory, repeating cycles of conflict. The truths buried under victory were not meant to shame, but to warn. They revealed how easily power justified itself, how quickly suffering was normalized, how readily memory was shaped to serve the present. To remember fully is to resist simplification. It is to honor all who lived through history, not just those who benefited from its outcomes. It is to accept that victory without truth is incomplete.
The New World Order. Promises of peace built on the ruins of the past. After centuries of conflict, collapse, and reconstruction, a new world order began to take shape. The survivors of shattered empires, displaced populations, and broken societies dared to imagine a future built on peace, stability, and cooperation. Governments were formed, treaties signed, and institutions established to prevent the horrors of the past from repeating. Optimism reigned, yet beneath the surface, the shadows of history lingered, threatening to shape this new order in ways both subtle and profound. The architects of this new era approached their work with determination. They had witnessed the fragility of empires and the devastating consequences of unaddressed grievances. Their goal was to create systems that could endure, balancing power across nations, fostering diplomacy over domination, and promoting social welfare alongside economic growth. Constitutions were drafted, charters ratified, and principles enshrined in law with careful deliberation. It was, in many ways, an experiment in learning from the past. International alliances emerged as pillars of this vision. States that had once been enemies found common cause in shared security, economic cooperation, and cultural exchange. Organizations were established to monitor conflict, mediate disputes, and facilitate communication across borders. Global governance, once an abstract concept, became a tangible pursuit, promising the possibility of collective oversight in a world prone to chaos. Yet the promise of this new order was fragile. Power vacuums left by fallen empires could not be erased overnight. Old elites adapted, finding ways to embed themselves in emerging institutions, often perpetuating hierarchies and practices that the architects of reform had sought to eliminate. Wealth, influence, and entrenched privilege did not vanish. They merely assumed new forms, continuing patterns of inequality beneath the surface of formal stability. Human nature, too, proved resistant to design. While laws and agreements could dictate behavior in theory, enforcement depended on cooperation, trust, and collective will. Nationalism, greed, and ambition persisted, reminding all that no system could fully control the impulses that had led to past disasters. Conflicts were no longer inevitable on the battlefield, but competition for resources, influence, and recognition remained potent forces in shaping international relations. The shadow of previous mistakes loomed large. Borders drawn in haste or imposed by force continued to divide populations whose histories and cultures were intertwined. Minority communities, displaced generations, and unresolved territorial disputes carried grievances forward, threatening the stability of even the most carefully negotiated settlements. Peace required constant vigilance, not complacency. Economic reconstruction was equally complex. Entire regions had been devastated by war, their infrastructure destroyed, and their economies fragmented.
Investments in trade, education, and industry became central to the promise of prosperity, yet inequality persisted. Some benefited more than others, creating tensions that echoed the imbalances of the old world. Economic progress could not erase historical memory, nor could it automatically foster social cohesion. Cultural and social renewal played a crucial role in defining the new order. Educational systems were reimagined to promote critical thinking, civic responsibility, and empathy. Artistic expression, literature, and performance became mediums for processing collective trauma, remembering loss, and imagining futures that transcended old divisions. Memory itself was contested. Which narratives would be celebrated and which silenced? Choices in remembrance shaped not only identity, but the moral compass of generations to come. Technology and communication accelerated both opportunity and risk. Improved transportation, telegraphs, radio, and eventually early digital networks allowed ideas to travel faster than ever, connecting distant regions in ways previously impossible. Knowledge of human rights, international law, and humanitarian principles became widely accessible, but misinformation, propaganda, and selective memory also spread with similar speed. The new order required not only institutions, but discernment. Despite these efforts, old patterns re-emerged. Power struggles continued in subtle forms. Corruption infiltrated new governments. Political opportunism exploited gaps in governance. Leaders occasionally prioritized personal ambition over public interest. The lessons of history, though learned in theory, proved difficult to embed in practice. Peace was an achievement, but not a permanent guarantee. Moreover, the psychological scars of past turmoil influenced behavior in profound ways. Generations who had grown up during war and collapse carried trauma that affected governance, negotiation, and societal trust. Fear of repetition shaped decision-making, sometimes leading to excessive caution, and sometimes to overly aggressive strategies designed to prevent perceived threats. Human behavior, history reminded all, was never fully predictable. Yet, the New World Order also revealed human resilience and capacity for learning. Communities rebuilt, trade flourished, and cultural exchange blossomed. Societies experimented with forms of governance that emphasized accountability, equality, and justice. International dialogue, while imperfect, became a standard rather than an exception. Diplomacy replaced conquest as the preferred mode of engagement, and cooperation offered hope where violence had previously dominated. Education, in particular, became a cornerstone of hope. Children born into this era were taught to understand the mistakes of the past, to value empathy alongside ambition, and to recognize the shared humanity of all peoples. Civic responsibility was framed not as duty to a single ruler, but as stewardship of society and the world. In classrooms, history became both a warning and an inspiration. Yet the tension between idealism and reality remained. Every institution, every treaty, every agreement was only as strong as the commitment of those who upheld it. The risk of regression was ever present. Complacency, arrogance, or exploitation could unravel progress. Those who had inherited peace understood that vigilance was as crucial as creation. The New World Order also had to confront moral ambiguity. Acts of suppression, conquest, or coerced migration left legacies that could not simply be undone. Reconciliation required acknowledgement, apology, and sometimes restitution. Nations and communities faced the challenge of integrating justice with pragmatism, remembering the past while building a future that could endure. As decades passed, the promise of the New World Order was tested repeatedly. Crises emerged: political upheaval, economic disruption, and localized conflict. Each test illuminated both strengths and weaknesses. Societies that learned from prior mistakes fared better. Those that relied on myth and selective memory were more vulnerable. History, once again, proved to be both teacher and adversary. Ultimately, the New World Order demonstrated that human systems are dynamic, fragile, and resilient all at once. Peace built on ruins was never simple. It required ongoing negotiation, continual reflection, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The architects of this era understood that stability was not a static achievement, but an ongoing process, dependent on human vigilance, empathy, and integrity. The promise of this age lay not in perfection, but in the attempt. By acknowledging the ruins beneath their feet, leaders and citizens alike committed to creating a world that could withstand both human error and ambition. They understood that history was neither finished nor neutral. It was a responsibility, a shared burden, and a source of guidance. And so, in the ashes of empires, in the aftermath of war, and atop the scars of collapse, a new world order emerged. It was imperfect, yet purposeful. It was hopeful, yet cautious. It was human in all its complexity. It did not erase the past, nor did it pretend mistakes had never happened. Instead, it sought to build on them, learning, adapting, and striving for a future where peace might endure. The New World Order was not a conclusion, it was a beginning, a testament to human resilience, the enduring desire for stability, and the careful balancing act between hope and history.
Echoes that still remain. Why this history still shapes the modern world. History is rarely finished. Even when textbooks declare that a war ended, an empire collapsed, or a treaty was signed, its consequences ripple across centuries, shaping the politics, culture, and society of generations that never lived through it. The past is not a distant landscape, it is the foundation beneath our feet, the currents beneath every decision, every policy, every social movement. For the modern world, particularly in America and globally, these echoes remain visible, persistent, and sometimes unexpected. Consider the political structures that dominate the United States and other nations today. Constitutions, representative institutions, and the rule of law are celebrated as achievements of modern governance, yet their very design bears the imprint of centuries-old struggles, debates over authority and liberty, revolutions sparked by overreach, and compromises made to hold fragile unions together. The founding documents of America, for example, were forged in a world still grappling with empire, rebellion, and internal dissent. The framers borrowed from lessons learned from collapse, victory, and survival, but they also carried forward flaws that would echo for generations, from inequalities enshrined in law to systemic exclusions that later movements sought to correct. Globally, borders remain reminders of decisions made under duress, ambition, or ignorance. Many nations today trace their political geography to treaties negotiated after wars they did not fight, or empires that vanished long ago. The lines drawn by past rulers, often without regard to culture, ethnicity, or community, continue to influence conflicts, migrations, and alliances. The reverberations of historical decisions are not abstract. They manifest in diplomacy, in refugee crises, in disputes over resources, and even in local elections that determine which communities have voice and which do not. Economic patterns, too, are products of long historical forces. Trade networks, financial centers, and global supply chains exist because of centuries of conquest, colonization, and innovation. The wealth accumulated by some nations, the exploitation suffered by others, and the uneven pace of development are all threads woven into today's economic reality.
Decisions taken by the victors of wars, the administrators of empires, and the architects of reconstruction continue to define who has opportunity, who faces barriers, and who carries intergenerational legacies of advantage or disadvantage. Even culture carries echoes. Languages, customs, and art forms have survived conflict, migration, and social upheaval, yet they are layered with history. American literature, music, and political discourse reflect centuries of ideas about freedom, justice, and identity, while simultaneously grappling with the unresolved impacts of slavery, displacement, and inequality. Globally, art and narrative continue to reinterpret events of the past, influencing modern identity, perception, and diplomacy. Memory shapes meaning, and meaning shapes action. The lessons of war and rebellion remain instructive, particularly in an era where power is both concentrated and diffuse. Military history teaches that dominance is fragile, that strategy and logistics matter as much as courage, and that internal division can be as lethal as any external threat. Contemporary policymakers, military leaders, and diplomats must understand not only the immediate facts on the ground, but the historical forces that shape perception, loyalty, and decision-making. Echoes of past collapses remind us that strength without adaptability, or unity without legitimacy, invites failure. Social movements, too, are shaped by memory. Civil rights struggles, feminist movements, and calls for justice draw from centuries of resistance, rebellion, and survival. The courage of ordinary people, recorded or unrecorded, resonates in contemporary advocacy. Protest, organization, and activism are part of a continuum that stretches from whispered dissent in broken empires to the digital mobilizations of today. Individuals continue to challenge power not only by immediate injustice, but by a long historical awareness that authority must be questioned to remain accountable. Technology and communication, hallmarks of the modern era, amplify these historical echoes. Information travels instantaneously, connecting people across continents. Movements gain momentum quickly, but misinformation spreads alongside truth, echoing the same tensions seen in past centuries when narratives were curated to protect the interests of the powerful. The digital age magnifies the lessons of selective memory, propaganda, and the importance of historical literacy. Understanding the past becomes not a matter of curiosity, but a necessity for navigating contemporary challenges. Even environmental and social systems bear historical imprints. Agricultural practices, land use, and urban planning often reflect centuries-old decisions, some pragmatic, some exploitative. Wars, colonization, and industrialization left landscapes scarred, sometimes irreversibly. Climate, population distribution, and urban infrastructure today are shaped by choices made long before the modern era, demonstrating that the consequences of past actions persist far beyond their immediate context. Global alliances and conflicts illustrate the persistent weight of history. Treaties, rivalries, and institutions often owe as much to historical memory as to present interests. The formation of the United Nations, NATO, and other multilateral organizations was informed by the collapse of previous empires and the devastation of global wars. Their structures, successes, and failures reflect lessons learned, as well as the limitations of human ambition and fallibility. Understanding the past helps explain why some agreements endure while others unravel, why trust is fragile, and why peace demands constant effort. Even individual identity is inseparable from historical echoes. People inherit memory not only through stories and records, but through cultural norms, societal expectations, and economic structures. Communities carry trauma, resilience, and knowledge passed down across generations. Recognition of history, both the triumphs and the failures, is essential to shaping values, perspectives, and decisions in the modern world. Ignoring it risks repeating errors that seem new only because they appear in a contemporary guise. The central lesson is clear. History is never truly over. Each generation inherits the outcomes of previous struggles, decisions, and mistakes. Power is not absolute, peace is not permanent, and progress is never guaranteed. The present is always built upon the choices, successes, and failures of the past. Societies that recognize this can learn, adapt, and improve. Those that ignore it risk repeating patterns that history has already recorded. America, with its complex democratic institutions, global influence, and domestic struggles, exemplifies this reality. Its founding principles emerged from rebellion, compromise, and resilience. Its contemporary challenges, social inequality, political polarization, and international responsibility, reflect centuries of inherited decisions, both brilliant and flawed. The echoes of history are visible in policy debates, civic engagement, cultural expression, and the persistent struggle to reconcile ideals with reality. Globally, nations that experience rapid modernization or post-conflict reconstruction must contend with similar echoes. Development, diplomacy, and reconciliation are never purely contemporary acts. They are always dialogues with history. Recognizing this reality encourages humility, strategic thinking, and ethical responsibility. It reminds leaders that solutions divorced from historical context are fragile and incomplete. Ultimately, the lesson extends beyond policy, governance, and international relations. It shapes how individuals perceive responsibility, memory, and citizenship. Understanding that the past is alive in the present encourages critical thinking, empathy, and engagement. It reminds people that every decision, public or private, contributes to a chain that will influence those who come after. The modern world is, in many ways, a reflection of history's cumulative weight. Institutions, borders, economies, and cultures are all palimpsests, overwritten repeatedly but never fully blank. Wars, collapses, rebellions, and reconstruction left marks that endure, teaching lessons about power, resilience, and morality. Recognition of these echoes allows societies to navigate complexity with awareness, reducing the likelihood of repeating unavoidable mistakes. In the final analysis, history is a dialogue, not a monologue.